Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up today, we're going to be taking a look back at the year in US politics and asking our panel of guests, how did 2025 shape up? Hello and thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, with 2025 fast drawing to a close, today we're going to look back at some of the main political developments of the year. Well, President Donald Trump himself has also been reflecting on the first 10 months of his second term in the White House. In a pre-holiday address, the president framed 2025 as a turnaround year for the United States, outlining his main accomplishments and promising that the economy would be even stronger next year. But for the setbacks and the challenges facing the United States, notably high prices, crime and immigration, President Trump laid blame squarely on his predecessor, President Joe Biden.
I've restored American strength, settled 8 wars in 10 months, destroyed the Iran nuclear threat, and ended the war in Gaza, bringing for the first time in 3,000 years peace to the Middle East, and secured the release of the hostages, both living and dead. Here at home, we're bringing our economy back from the brink of ruin. The last administration and their allies in Congress looted our treasury for trillions of dollars, driving up prices and everything at levels never seen before. I am bringing those high prices down and bringing them down very fast.
President Trump speaking there in his holiday address. Well, to discuss the year, we're joined today by Angie Wong, Republican strategist, who joins us from Miami, Florida. Welcome to the program, Angie. Great to have you with us. We're also joined by Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas, who joins us from Washington. Great to have you with us as well. Both familiar faces on Al Arabiya English. We speak to you both often. Now, let me start by asking you, Angie, why don't we start with you? President Trump's pre-holiday address, what are people saying about what point President Trump was seeking to make when he gave that address, looking back on the year?
Well, President Trump wanted to tout all of his accomplishments because, well, the media here doesn't like it. They just like the scandals. Look, President Trump started this second term with a sense of urgency. He was governing with a sense of urgency. He hit the ground running come January 2025, and he hasn't stopped since. He's been just running, and harder to basically turn around the Biden administration that he inherited, and also the Biden economy. He's flipped the geopolitics upside down, and now it seems as though America has respect again. I think that's what he wanted to do, and he also realized that he only had about 100 to 200 days to get it done, all really quickly before the knives came out, and that's what we're seeing in Washington today. So he wanted to give the address yesterday to the nation to reassure Americans that things are okay, things are on the up. And that's what he touted. He touted a closed border. He touted inflation slowing down. And he's also touting that he is making deals with every big agency he can and big corporation he can to lower prices for all Americans.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about prices because that's a really key issue, isn't it? And Greg, since you're in Washington, and Angie mentioned that the knives are out there in Washington, I mean, what evidence is there the knives are out? And also, let me ask you, what do you think the tone was that President Trump was trying to strike last night?
Yeah, I think the president, in many ways, is kicking off the midterm election year of 2026. There were some disappointments with the off-year elections in this past November, and I think that in many respects the communications were often, there's no lack of communications. There's a lot of transparency, but I do think they didn't focus enough on the economy, and the Democrats did a good job of highlighting affordability. That's the new trendy word here in the US. And affordability is an issue. And it's thanks to Joe Biden that we have this affordability crisis. But the Democrats did a great job of ignoring that or avoiding that in November, and managed to get people to vote for them because they were proposing that they would fix the affordability crisis, which is hysterical to consider that they caused it and left President Trump to fix it. So I think that the president was wise to get out, at the now really the beginning of the midterm year and highlight the fact that he is fixing the affordability crisis. He will fix the economy. It does take time, but the policies that he put in place, especially with the big, beautiful bill, will work. Tax reform, deregulation, and liberation of the energy sector and the private sector in general. It worked for him in his first term. It worked for Reagan. It worked for John Kennedy. So I'm pretty confident it will work again.
Okay, what about the knives being out? Are you seeing any knives out there in Washington?
Absolutely. I mean, look, the mainstream, many people still get their information from the mainstream media here in the U.S., and they've always hated President Trump. They typically hate Republicans in general. So it's really a tough battle to fight. I've always advised, get over it. There's a liberal bias. Of course, there always has been, but the bias, it's really changed from a liberal bias to liberal activism. And as Angie pointed out, they only talk about the scandals or they create the scandals rather than focusing on the accomplishments of this administration, which have been significant. So, good for him for, he's always been, one to speak directly to the people and avoid the knives of the mainstream media and just go right through it. And that's what he did last night. So good for him.
Angie, are there any knives within the GOP itself, metaphorically speaking? I mean, we've read, reports and we've heard, anecdotes suggesting there are some splits between traditional conservative Republicans and MAGA populists. Do you think too much is being made of those splits, or what are your thoughts?
No, I think it's very real. I mean, if we're going to have a frank conversation about the GOP, there are some divides, and mainly because very early on, Trump demands an absolutism kind of mindset when you are with him. And I think that's exactly right, because remember, his first administration, he brought in a lot of establishment GOPs into the cabinet, and they messed around with him and caused him a lot of time in his first administration. This time around, he knows how to do it better. He brought in loyalists versus those with more experience, mainly because they are on the same wavelength, and they knew how to work with him and get things done really quickly. But, talking about knives, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly seeing the divide. We can't not see it. You certainly saw it in Indiana recently when they voted no on the new Republican districting map. You're starting to see it with Marjorie Taylor Greene and other people who are deflecting from the MAGA crowd. We're hearing of more retirements coming up next year. So all of this is worrying me because we've known for a long time, Tom, and we've spoken about this, that the MAGA brand, well, it's not that stylish anymore. And I think there's going to be a new iteration of that. And hopefully that folds in some of, what other GOPers want as well, whether that's more traditionalist or more modern, we can debate that later on. But Trump can't demand an absolutist mindset anymore because he realizes he's going to have to work with all spectrum of those within the Republican Party in order to get the numbers passed. Because look, the House has a razor-thin majority right now. The Senate, John Thune's not pushing through all of those things that all the bills that Trump needs passed to get the America First agenda going. So he's going to have to learn how to, negotiate and work with everybody. And everyone's got different terms because they know they can. They know the margins are that slim. And hopefully in the midterms we'll win more. But for now, he's going to have to make some concessions. It's not an absolutism mindset.
Sure. And Greg, I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that's one notable name that sprung to mind, and Angie just mentioned her there. I mean, does President Trump need to be worried if she's not quite as on side as she used to be?
I'm not sure. I think without President Trump or without their partnership, she's not going to draw a big audience. And so you've got, the MTGs of the world on the right, and then you have the so-called moderate or establishment Republicans in the center. But that's in many ways been a failure. That whole movement, the Lincoln Project back in 2020, turned out to be mostly, consultants and lobbyists and Democrats that were creating that. So I think there's probably more noise about this potential split in the party. I don't think the the party of George W. Bush and John McCain and Mitt Romney. I don't think they're coming back. I think it's a permanent shift. And so, whether depending on who the heir is to the MAGA movement, I think I don't imagine it's going back to the country club Republican.
Right, but we are ending the year with a slightly worrying rating. The latest Reuters Ipsos poll, I don't know if you believe them, I don't know if you look at them, shows that President Trump's approval rating is at the lowest level of his second term in office. 39% of US adults approving of his job performance. Angie, is that something that the GOP and President Trump's inner sanctum need to be worried about?
Well, I certainly am not worried about it because these polls, I've seen numbers anywhere in the 30s to the 40s. I mean, they're still a lot better than when the previous administration, like Biden, was at this very time of his presidency. So I'm not really relying on the numbers as much as I am on what's to come and what President Trump is trying to accomplish. Look, the first 11 months of his presidency has been nothing but just hard work, determination, and making the impossible possible. He's, certainly put a pause on a lot of the world conflicts, and he's going after terrorist groups. He's doing things domestically. I mean, this man doesn't sleep, right? So I think a lot of it just has to take time for it to come to fruition, where you and I can see the accomplishments really affect whether it's our pocketbooks, our, national security, or otherwise. But, I think President Trump's frustrated that more and more Americans are not feeling, I guess, the benefits of all the hard work just yet. And, I'm very optimistic. I think by quarter 2, quarter 3 of next year, we're going to start seeing the real effects of the tariffs. We're going to start seeing more and more of the effects of what it means to stop some of the terrorist groups that President Trump is trying to cut pipelines for, and other good things that the Trump administration is doing. But it does need more time and, just clear runway in order for that to happen. Hopefully it happens before the midterms.
Right. And Greg, I mean, just listening to the president's pre-holiday address, all 18 minutes of it, I mean, there wasn't much in there about international relations, even though that has been quite a dominant feature of his first year of the second term. Do you think there was a conscious decision made, right, time to get back to these so-called kitchen table issues ahead of the midterms?
Without a doubt, Tom. Great question or great comment. And that's absolutely the case. He didn't mention foreign policy at all. I think one small reference to the Middle East. But, what he's done has been fantastic for world peace. He's an anti-war president. He's a peace president. But that's not what people vote for. The reality is in America, people vote on economic issues and pocketbook issues. So, yeah, there's clearly a shift. And I think, back to the polls, remember 45 years ago, Ronald Reagan was polling at 35 in January of 1983. And less than 2 years later, he won 49 states. So, this is a turnaround in the making, but economic policy usually takes 9 to 12 months to really see any effects from it. We're seeing some good things so far, but I think the president was wise to highlight the fact that, we have a turnaround coming and just be patient.
Right, and Angie, the president was probably thinking back, wasn't he, to the off-season elections and electoral races that happened in the last couple of months. I mean, not to mention New York, where Mamdani came out as the city mayor. But in all of those races, it sounds like, the economy, this issue of affordability that we've already talked about, really were the main weapons and the drums that the Democrats were beating in those electoral campaigns. We're going to see more of this next year, aren't we?
Absolutely. And whoever owns the messaging on affordability will win the midterms in 2026. That is what all Americans care about. It affects every single person, everything from the healthcare insurance all the way down to grocery bills to insurance, everything like that. So President Trump understands that. Right after Zoran Mamdani won the New York mayoralship, the very next morning, President Trump went to a senatorial breakfast and started using the word affordability. And now he's even calling himself the affordability president. He's named Scott Bessent the affordability czar. He is going to do everything he can between now and November 2026 to lower prices and make sure that you and I actually feel the effects of that. Right now, the American consumer doesn't actually see it or feel it. And I think that is critical here, is whether or not you and I feel secure in our savings, whether or not you and I are buried under debt, and whether or not this administration can do something about it. Because right now, the American dream is getting harder and harder to attain. And if you do try to attain it, you are signing up for a lifetime full of debt. So I think President Trump wants to address that, because young voters can't jump in without signing their lives away to the 30-year mortgage or to a college degree that, spends decades paying off a college loan, or even getting a car, things like that. So these are real issues that I think the federal government can take care of. And I know President Trump would love to do that, especially for young Americans.
Greg, just looking back at the year, do you think the Zohran Mamdani electoral win in New York was a bit of a pivotal moment? Because in the campaign, President Trump was, not particularly, let's say, complimentary about Mayor-elect Mamdani. But then they had that Oval Office meeting, and they seemed to get along pretty well. And I'm wondering, just listening to what Angie was saying as well, whether perhaps a bit of the Mamdani effect rubbed off on President Trump. Do you think that there's an argument there?
Yeah, there is, because, they are similar in a certain way in the fact that they both ran on sort of a populist message, and Mamdani, he embraced the affordability issue and took it head on. And, his solutions are quite different than what President Trump's solutions are. President Trump wants to fix that problem by liberating the private sector, which he did in the first term quite successfully. And you had a fantastic increase in real wages. Wages adjusted for inflation were fantastic in the first term. Real wages adjusted for inflation were down in the Biden years. So wages went down 4% under Biden. So the average American lost buying power to the tune of $3,300 a year. And now we've recovered $1,200 in real wage increases this year, but that's a long way to go. We've only recovered around a third of the losses suffered under the Biden administration. So I think the Democrats were quite cheeky to avoid that topic during the campaign in November. They did it well, sort of sidestep that they caused it, and they all voted for the bill, the bills that increased government spending, that caused the inflation, that really hurt the private sector and hurt real wages. So look, I think the president, again, is wise to focus on that. Reaching out to Mamdani was a smart move. That, New York is still an important city. And also remember that, he only got 50% of the vote, right? And it was basically a Democrat election. Only 10% of the voters were Republicans in New York in November. So I don't see it as a massive shift toward the progressive left. We've already had a progressive mayor in New York in the form of the mayor from 2014 to 21. That was a disaster for New York. So I don't think it could get much worse. We've had the same thing in Chicago with Brandon Johnson. So we've already experienced the downside of these progressive left mayors. And I'm seeing Mamdani already pivot. He's in many ways embraced free market capitalism by his visit to the bodega last week, and he's already looking and sounding like Milton Friedman more than Vladimir, than a communist or a Marxist. So I think that's going to work out, and I don't think the Democrats will shift. There is that split in the party, no doubt about it. You had the same thing in Seattle with the mayoral race there, but the other winners, New Jersey, Virginia, they sort of moved to the center and focused on affordability without going, totally Marxist. So I don't think that's as big a deal as we thought in November.
Yeah, it's something I never thought I would hear people saying, that President Trump and Zohran Mamdani have stuff in common. But now we're talking about it. I mean, let's face it, they can both draw quite a crowd. Now, Angie, let me turn back to you, because one of the other big points that President Trump made in that holiday address, and one of the big issues and themes throughout these last 10, 11 months, has been the issue of immigration. On that score, would you say President Trump has delivered?
Oh, I think he has more than delivered. Look, on day one, he had Tom Holman, the border czar, shut down the borders. Now we're getting single digits crossing every single day versus the millions that were crossing every month illegally into the U.S. So I think that has been on the scorecard at least an A, if not A minus. The only reason why I give the minus is because the closed border kind of the PR of it was not done very well, and certainly in communities like mine in Miami, people don't like to see that relatives deported, and I think there's been a lot of fear mongering, especially amongst the Democrat and Latino communities, that are stirring up trouble, especially for ICE agents, and we've been seeing that around the U.S. for several months now. There's been, I guess they call it protests, I call it violence. But there's been a lot of that kind of naughtiness happening, and it doesn't work well. And certainly we've lost a few Latino voters because of that. But for the most part, a secure border means that we have a secure economy and that I feel safer at home. There's that sense that President Trump has delivered on the secure border. So I think that's been a really nice thing. I just want to get back to the point where, just a year ago, we had Joe Biden in office. Imagine if he gave a national speech like that. You and I would be having a very different conversation to see whether or not he could even make it through an 18-minute speech, right, without fumbling entirely. So I think President Trump gave a great, strong speech, although I didn't see anything new come from the speech. I was hoping for some surprises, but it just seems like he had a very disciplined message to say, this is what I've done, this is what I'm going to continue to do, and let's get it done, because he wants a full 4-year presidency without any interruptions, and that's what the GOP has to deliver for him, is a House majority and a Senate majority. That way he can fully realize the America First agenda.
Okay, so you're saying results speak for themselves, but the optics and the comms perhaps could have done with a bit more work. Greg, would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Look, even though this administration is completely, perhaps the most transparent administration ever and great communicators, I do think they took their eye away from the messaging on the economy and on affordability, and the Democrats embraced it. So, again, good for the Democrats for doing that and ignoring the fact that they caused it. But I do think you've seen a major change since early November. They've come out of the gates really focused on it. You'll see a lot more of the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. You'll see a lot more of him talking about affordability, and it will work. I mean, the liberation of the energy sector especially, but also tax reform and general deregulation, well, it always ends up helping real wages. It helps the average working person in America, unlike low interest rates and reckless government spending, which just really helps the rich get richer with asset inflation. So I'm pretty excited about 2026, and we should start to see the results. We're already starting to see it, but I think you'll see some significant real wage growth in the next year.
And on the issue of immigration, Greg, I mean, do you feel like perhaps there have been some PR disasters on this particular issue? I mean, for example, perhaps castigating a certain community, like the people of Somalia. I mean, has that gone down well? And do people say that perhaps that doesn't serve the interest of uniting a pretty divided country?
Yeah, I think there's some merit to that. And I do think that the messaging has to be really delicate because, again, the mainstream media is always going to be against anything the president does. But he's also reflecting the concerns that people have. And in cities like Chicago, where I live, it's really difficult. Women can't go out after dark, period. Like it's unless they're in an Uber or maybe not even driving their own car. It's really dangerous. And part of the reason for that is the mass migration crisis, illegal migration crisis, with all the unemployed illegal migrants running around Chicago. And then, of course, the mayor and the governor pushing back against the administration. So, yeah, it's a difficult optic. But I do think that the concern about crime, especially from illegal migrants, is probably more significant than the bad optics of ICE, the immigration enforcement people removing illegal migrants. I mean, if you look at, Laken Riley getting killed at the University of Georgia, that's just a classic example of reckless policy where an illegal migrant was arrested in New York and given that New York is a so-called sanctuary city, he was released the next day by another Soros-backed DA that chose to reduce his felony to a misdemeanor. He takes a bus to Georgia, another sanctuary city, or sanctuary city in sense of Athens, Georgia, where the university is. So those are examples that people look at, and I think the president feels compelled to do something about it, regardless of the optics.
Okay, let's pivot across to foreign policy. As we've said, not much mention of foreign policy in the pre-holiday address, but there has been no shortage of foreign policy activity from this administration during these last 10 or 11 months. Angie, I mean, out of all of the foreign policy issues, and we've talked about them a lot on this channel, Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, the situation regarding Greenland, the brewing situation off the coast of Venezuela. What stands out for you as being perhaps the most significant, perhaps the most, the greatest accomplishment for the Trump administration?
Well, there's been so many. I mean, there was the Gaza Phase 1 celebration where where President Trump skipped over the UN and brought in all his foreign leader friends to celebrate in Egypt. I thought that was a great celebration. Although it was a great optics, there was really no strategic reset. And I think that is kind of my overall assessment of his entire foreign policy strategy, is that there were a lot of great starts, but nothing has really been finished. Nothing has really stuck. I mean, take Ukraine, Russia, for example, right? There's been a lot of talks, a lot of optics, a lot of airplanes flown over Putin's head in Alaska, but ultimately, no results just yet. And we don't actually see an end game. Even President Trump, or rather Don Jr., has come out to say, well, we may step away from that because there is no end game in some of these wars and some of these world conflicts. They just keep going on and on. We saw it with Thailand recently, right, where they started up again. So, I feel like President Trump might be spending a lot of time trying to solve these issues and find world peace, which, I congratulate him on. But, yesterday's message was directly to the Americans because it was an American audience, but more importantly, because the people who voted for him and voted him in last November wants to see results domestically. So I think he needs to go back and, re-engage with Americans again. But I do hope that he's able to bring a lot of the world conflicts and a lot of these talks. I know Russia's delegation's coming to Miami this weekend to further talk with perhaps shutting it down with Ukraine. We don't know. Everyone's always optimistic, but then there's always a pause. But that's how it works with a lot of these conflicts.
Right. And looking back, Greg, so many, as Angie said, so many foreign policy issues have sort of presented themselves in President Trump's inbox. And he's tried to tackle a great number of them. And do you agree with Angie's assessment that perhaps results not too many to speak of yet? And perhaps, do you think there's a case of perhaps too many irons at the fire at once?
Well, I think the president is able to delegate a lot of that. And I think his team has done a great job, starting with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. But I do think we all agree that the pivot back to domestic issues is absolutely necessary, because it's important to his legacy and to his, but more importantly, to his voters. And I think it's all about the midterms. And as Angie pointed out, whoever fixes whoever can claim that issue and claim to have fixed the problem is going to win here. And the Republicans and the president have a great opportunity in that area. So I think it's a natural pivot away from foreign policy. I think he can be proud of what he's done so far. And I do think that, that the highlight perhaps is the Israel-Gaza settlement. And again, there's going to be bumps in the road there. There's, we're seeing it already with Hamas. But generally speaking, I think the president can be really proud of what he and his team have done. But it is time to pivot back to domestic issues, no doubt.
One of the perhaps most enduring images of 2025 geopolitically was that Oval Office showdown between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. I mean, Angie, does that stand out for you as perhaps being one of the most unforgettable moments?
Yeah, I was thinking back. So I was at, there's a bar in Trump Tower where there's a huge photo of Kim Jong-un shaking Donald Trump's hand at the DMZ. And I'm wondering what that image is going to be like for his second administration. It may be that Oval Office showdown. I thought that was great. Zelensky, we've been writing him blank checks for years. And it was time that we stopped because something's got to happen. We were not there to forever take care of him and his country. So, I would like to see a resolution on that quicker, maybe even by next year. Even if we don't end the war there, I don't like to see Americans writing blank checks to another country over and over again. And I think President Trump has tried to ask EU and NATO members to, foot the bill. And he did do that. There was an increase of 5% in defense spending from each one of the allies, which hopefully then goes and supplies, whether it's to support the Ukraine war or other methods. I think that was a good first step. But I think all of this, right, is to push the ownership on everyone else. It can't just be the United States taking care of everybody anymore. And I think for far too long, our previous presidents have allowed this. For whatever reasons, whether national security, diplomatic relations, whatnot. But President Trump saying, hey, no more. Let's everyone take their own fair share if we're all going to play together well. And I loved seeing the shifts of global alliances. You could see what's going on there. NATO and the UN, they're kind of in the background now. President Trump just said, well, what have you been doing for the last few decades? We've been financing you and you've delivered nothing. So I think he's kind of like rethinking how that's going to work. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he does with NATO and the UN in the coming years. I think that the moment for 2025 was certainly Zelensky in the Oval Office. And I hope he learned his lesson from that.
Okay, Greg, do you think President Trump's perhaps been a bit harsh on President Zelensky, given that his country was invaded by a hostile country and, he's not the aggressor here, is he?
No, but I don't think he blames Zelensky. It's obviously Putin is the wild card here, but the president just wants to stop the killing. So however he can get to that point, he'll exploit both sides to get an end to this war. But remember, he was very good to Zelensky. The first 40 minutes of that meeting was very productive. It was only the last 13 minutes that went south. And that's on Zelensky because he just kept pushing the envelope with both the president and the vice president. And that's when it went south, was only after minute 40. And I do think that, that was a good moment for Zelensky in the long run, because I think he had to understand that he can't just keep begging for money or assuming that the U.S. would just keep writing these blank checks and not be a little thankful for it. So I think that was an important moment. I think Zelensky has handled the relationship very well since then. And I think, again, the wild card here is Putin, but the president will, I think, continue to try to end the conflict and just stop the body bags from piling up.
Okay, so we've talked about how President Trump inherited some major geopolitical hot potatoes in the form of Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza. Yeah. He's also sort of made gestures towards, indications that he may be eyeing up new conflicts, notably Venezuela, and possibly annexing Greenland. That's one of the things he said quite early on as well. I mean, he was voted, wasn't he, Angie, to stop old wars and not start any new ones. How's this going to go down, do you think, with his support base?
I think we've forgotten about that one. But look, the Venezuelan thing, the messaging needs to be much, much clearer. Most Americans are very confused as to why the U.S. is going after Venezuela right now. I think President Trump needs to come out in the forefront and say, look, we need to cut off the oil pipelines, which is the money that is financing a lot of the terrorist groups, as well as a lot of the world conflicts that we're seeing right now. That message has not really trickled down to the American in public. We don't know why drug boats are being blown up other than we didn't want drugs coming into our country. But I think if President Trump and the administration tells us, look, they're financing terror and gives us evidence, then we would be supportive of all the efforts going in, especially bringing in all the military aircrafts and closing down the Venezuelan airspace and things like that. We want to understand that. So far, that message has not been made clear to Americans, and I was really hoping he would address that last night, but I think he skipped over that. But remember who our Secretary of State is. It's Marco Rubio, right? He's very, very familiar, coming as a boy growing up in Miami. He's very familiar with what's happened with Venezuela. We've had a huge migration of Venezuelans moving into Miami and South Florida for the past few years because of the Maduro regime. And having been saturated in that community for many years now, I do understand that there is a desire, and certainly Latinos are very happy to see that the Maduro regime is getting squeezed and that the economy there is getting squeezed because it's possibly linked to terrorist groups.
Just briefly, Greg, your thoughts on that issue, starting new wars in the form, okay, let's put Greenland to one side, but Venezuela, I mean, how's that going to go down if he starts a war there?
Yeah, on the surface, it seems to be in contradiction to his general philosophy, which is not to start regime change wars, not to have any boots on the ground. But I do think that Venezuela is different. You've got a renewal of the Monroe Doctrine. You're hearing a lot about that from Secretary of State Rubio, who, by the way, is the son of Cuban immigrants. So there's been, he's had some experience with these communist regimes. So there's a renewal of the Monroe Doctrine. Venezuela, unlike Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, is in our sphere of influence. It's in our hemisphere. So it's important to make that distinction. And secondly, the other big difference between Venezuela and the forever wars of the last 2 decades is that they are really ready and ripe for democracy. They've had elections. You've got obviously, Maduro stole that election. I mean, he lost, by 70-30 by most measures, by most assumptions. So I do think that they're ready for democracy. It's not like we're imposing some system, democracy in this case, on a country that's just not ready for it and probably will never be ready for it. Afghanistan comes to mind. So I do think that's, there are differences between this conflict and other conflicts.
Okay, we've got about 60 seconds left. And just to wrap up, I mean, there were some notable foreign trips undertaken by President Trump these last 11 months. I mean, the ones that spring to mind, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, the Vatican. What stood out for you, Angie? Which trip did you think perhaps was the most impactful, most exciting?
Oh, for me, it was certainly his Asia trips. I thought him going to Japan and then meeting Xi Jinping in Korea, I thought those were very notable because guess what? These are our allies. These, President Trump touts them as our friends as well. We do, then they're our major trade partners. So I think it was good to keep up those relations, if not just the optics of it, because as much as we would love to have America be completely independent, we are somewhat dependent on our Asian neighbors. So it's good to keep up the trade relations there. So that was very notable for me in 2025.
Okay, Greg, your notable trips of 2025 for the president?
Yeah, I mean, for sure the pivot to Asia, and that's important and part of the general strategy. But I thought the trip to Saudi was important. You look at the foreign direct investment coming from both the Saudis and the Emiratis, and then of course compare it to the Biden trips where, Joe Biden was very critical of our allies. He got off on the wrong foot with both the UK, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And then 2 years later, when energy prices were really high, he went to Saudi to beg MBS to pump more oil, and of course MBS declined. And so I think you can see the notable difference between the relationship with the President Trump and the Saudis and the Emiratis versus President Biden.
Okay, Greg, you've had the last word. We're out of time. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas, thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you as well to Angie Wong, Republican strategist. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us for this look back on the year in US politics. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again next year with more exclusive interviews. Until then, do stay with us here on Al Arabiya English.